Hi, and thank you for joining us for this webinar on effectively aligning next generation science curriculum. My name is Francis Vigent, and I'm joining you from KnowAtom here on the North Shore of Massachusetts in Salem, Mass. Just to give you a quick overview of a bit of my background as well as KnowAtom. My background is as a K-12 teacher myself. I started as a high school math teacher and ended my time before joining KnowAtom as a elementary and middle school STEM specialist. KnowAtom is an organization of teachers focused on helping classrooms, particularly public classrooms, meet the needs of the next generation science standards and really meet the needs of effective STEM instruction. And our passion for STEM in particular is not only something that we like, but really that we see science, technology, engineering, and math as serving the needs of students when it comes to developing higher thinking skills, those creative, evaluative, and analytical thinking skills that are useful for any college or career choice. They're really life skills. And science, technology, engineering, and math we view as the perfect environment for developing those skills by using them, practicing them, and actually getting to interact with content. And so that's why being able to place students in the role of scientist and engineer is really something so vital, something that's central to what we do, but also really central to these next generation science standards. And of course, curriculum materials and professional development are aspects or tools for accomplishing those goals, but it really is that alignment and that purpose that higher order thinking skills serve across the curriculum that is the motivation behind next generation science standards, but also our own work as well. So to kind of give you a quick overview of how we're going to progress unpacking how to effectively align next generation science curriculum, we're going to kind of start with a big picture framework and sort of build to the specifics. And the alignment under next generation science standards is something that's going to be very new and different for a lot of folks because it is three-dimensional learning. It is not just a set of fact standards like many states have experienced, but it's really a combination of practices which are skills, content which interconnects in those disciplinary core ideas, and also systems behaviors which we see in the cross-cutting concepts that help form these performance expectations. So the format for our time together, if you're here on the live session, is going to be followed by a live question and answer session. You'll notice on the side of your screen that there is a panel where you can enter questions at any time, and those will be sent to me and a moderator, and I will go through those at the end. If there's something that I can hit while I'm going along the way, feel free to throw that in there as well. I expect that this will take about an hour, give or take a few minutes, and I will try to do my best to end in an hour. The agenda, we're going to start really by looking at how to build an authentic environment for student engagement in your curriculum, what it means to nurture science and engineering practices, and then the essential criteria for effective next generation curriculum. It's a tall order. This is really a lot of content as well as some really interesting nuances around these new standards, which we're boiling down into an hour here. So please, as questions come up, feel free to drop them in. If I can't answer them during the Q&A and live session, I will do my best either to follow up with you, or if you'd like, I'll provide my contact information at the end, and we can go through that. So without further ado, let's jump right in here. So when it comes to building authentic curriculum around authentic student engagement, we have to start by asking some questions of ourselves as educators. And this can really be on a personal level if you feel that you're a teacher in a classroom that's really operating all by yourself, not because you're the only teacher in the classroom, but really because there's no team dynamic in your building. If you're a principal and you have a team dynamic in your building that as principal you really are leading, then these are questions and discussions that need to be had at a building level, as a superintendent, at a district level, and so on. But this first question, really everything starts with why. Why does our school, why does my classroom even exist? And that gives us our values. If it's you in your classroom, it's really, why am I here? And what are the core beliefs that I as a teacher, sometimes we would call this our educational philosophy. What are those points that unite us as a team? And what many folks will say, especially if you ask this as a principal or as a superintendent of a team, is things ranging from rigor, growth, literacy, owning behavior, respect, be kind, we value data. But of all the things that people might say, what's really important is to identify that our values and things that really anchor us as a community of educators in our building, in our team, at our grade level, or even really the reason that we are committed as educators long term, have to do with things that are limitless. They're bigger than ourselves. They're things like respect, growth, engagement, community, things that is not really kind of a once and done. You can't just sort of check off growth or check off thinking or check off reasoning. It's something that we all as a team are part of the process of really building over time. And so that's why curriculum really starts at these core beliefs. And if you think about just a 3-person team at a particular grade level in a small building, in a small community, where there's overlap in those bigger, more limitless beliefs that we share, that's what unites us. And so what happens from there is our teams begin to really develop a mode of instruction. It's really the practices that reflect our values. And so when it comes to these next generation science standards, one of the places that people are going to be really challenged is if your community is really anchored around a lot of quantitative things like rigor, data, test prep, worksheets, drills, a lot of things that are more kind of check off or check the box kind of values, then what happens is your mode of instruction is going to have a hard time shifting, because the mode of instruction is most likely that kind of test prep, ad hoc, pulling materials together that are very kind of workbook oriented, or pieces like this, or textbook even. So if you think about that, it's right at the get-go, there's going to be an issue with the shift. So thinking about the instructional environment as reflecting the values, okay, so I want to just go back there. Things like data and achievement, that's something that's finite. Something like students being prepared for college, being prepared for careers, being able to offer them more opportunities. Those are things that shift us towards authentic student-centered instruction, things like understanding by design, things like inquiry. And so in those types of environments defined by those types of values, next generation science standards shifting in that direction is going to be much easier, because the instructional environment is going to be better aligned already. If it's not at that point, then this is a point of conversation that you already want to jump into. And the reason is that the final piece of the kind of questions we need to ask ourselves is how. How do we accomplish that? So when you think about something like that instructional environment, something being authentic and student-centered, understanding by design, inquiry-based, well, how do you actually accomplish that? What are the details of executing it? Because at the end of the day, if you are the type of environment that values really those bigger picture things, and you have that authentic student-centered instruction as your mode of instruction, understanding by design, inquiry, and so on, those types of modes, then the details of execution are not going to be worksheets, workbooks, textbook, rote drill and kill kind of stuff. It's going to be much more aligned to a next generation inquiry environment. We're going to unpack what that is in a moment. So when we think about that why, the what, and the how, it matters for next generation curriculum alignment because how we align our curriculum, how we design it, what it entails, what it includes, is going to mirror the mode of instruction, and it's going to mirror our values. So let's unpack that a bit here. If we ask ourselves why, in a next generation context, why even have next generation science standards? It has to do with long-term student outcomes, empowered citizens, innovative thinkers, students who are prepared to engage in actually developing new knowledge through the use of science by executing experiments, developing them, planning them, so on, actually solving problems by developing prototypes, and being science and engineering literate, really, is what it comes down to. When you think about the what, the mode of instruction is really a next generation inquiry environment, and like I said, we're going to look at that in a second. How we go about that is things like a defined scope and sequence that is not grade level agnostic, that is not sort of really wide open in terms of giving somebody a single page per trimester and saying, okay, now you have to kind of figure out how to do that. It's actually having a scope, sequence, vocabulary, nonfiction reading, things like Socratic dialogue, student-centered investigations where students are actually planning them, experimentation and prototyping. These are all the details of execution which would be consistent with that sort of next generation mode of inquiry. Students gathering data, forming evidence-based conclusions, presenting and defending their conclusions in class. And the reason that these details of execution look like this has to do with those science and engineering practices, and we're going to take a look at how that unfolds in a moment as well. So at a really high level, what I hope you take away from this is that as you jump into creating your own effective next generation curriculum or realigning in some way or trying to realign, you have to first start by asking yourself why, what, and how your school or your classroom is going to operate. And then from that, you have to really understand the why, what, and how of how next generation science standards operate and how that's going to be reflected in the classroom. Okay? The reason that this is such a departure in a lot of ways from a traditional model really has to do with this diagram that you see here. A traditional model of science instruction, regardless of grade level, is content being delivered through a teacher, where a teacher models facts, demonstrates phenomenon, and explains what. For students, their role in that environment is oftentimes recalling the facts, repeating what was demonstrated, and summarizing the phenomenon to show that they have done their job. And that traditional model, when we think about it from a student's perspective, really kind of sets them up in a situation that's really not consistent with innovation. And let's take a look at that. So if we ask ourselves, what's the student's perspective in a traditional learning environment, asking those same kind of questions, why go to school, for instance? And I'm going to answer these the way that my students did when I was had a high school class of students learning math in an urban environment. Why go to school? Well, I need to. I'm told to, everybody does it. I need a job when I grow up. If I don't, the truant officer is going to show up. If you ask the student, what is school? Unfortunately, a lot of times that traditional environment can lead to the type of explanation that it's doing what I need to do. Doing what I'm told, remembering what I was told or what I read, putting the right answer when I'm asked or when I'm tested. And you can see that that correlates to a kind of mode of instruction. If we ask the final question of the student, how should I participate in science class, then the implication is by doing what's given to me, by reading the book, by following the steps, by filling in the blank, by behaving and raising my hand, by circling the answer, copying the step diagram, following the diagram, explaining what was explained to me, and that being kind of the details of the execution. And in many environments where there's a traditional model of instruction, there are a lot of pieces of this which are true and are consistent. And I know here it sort of paints a bit of a bleak picture, and I don't want to do that, but I want to just emphasize that with the next generation science standards, this can't be. There will not be student success even now under this sort of traditional model with the type of standardized assessments that exist nationally. But furthermore, it's really important to kind of consider that the details of execution have to change, and if they change, then oftentimes the expectation of what school is and why we go to school has to change as well. And that's something that is a kind of cultural change. You can see how it comes from curriculum and instruction and our expectations of students, but on the flip side, it's also something that students internalize, because when you think about a student kind of reflecting back, to a student, that is what the world expects of me, that I do what's given to me, and that's why education is valuable. And so I can remember my own students coming to me and saying, well, I turned in my homework. That means I get an A, and it's actually not about turning in the homework. It's actually about doing your homework well and actually engaging in the thinking and meeting the expectations that are higher than just turning in the homework, because students at that point were expecting to get a grade for just completing what they had done and not necessarily completing it well and appropriately. So that's where a next generation model of science instruction comes in here and how it relates, because in a next generation model of instruction, the role of the teacher, the content, and the student changes dramatically. So a teacher's role in a next generation inquiry environment is really to tune that environment, to gradually adjust supports so that students understand how to engage appropriately. They help redirect and monitor, but it's really the student who is developing those science and engineering practice skills and using them to develop and use the content. And that's why the student here in this diagram has a direct relationship to the content and the cross-cutting concepts, and they're internalizing the skills. So those three dimensions, that's how they come to life. So the teacher is no longer this kind of bottleneck or conduit. On the flip side, the student is demonstrating proficiency by demonstrating the expectations. So they're developing and using the content. They are actually using their skills to solve problems. They're using those science and engineering practices to answer questions, and being able to describe and really use the disciplinary core content to describe the interactions between concepts and use the vocabulary and concepts appropriately, and so on. And we'll kind of talk about what that mastery is further in a second. But think about how that model shifts a student's perspective when we ask those same three questions, the why, the what, and the how. So why go to school? In this case, when the student is in that role of scientist or engineer and having to use their skills, develop and use those skills to develop and use the content and observe the cross-cutting concepts, the reason that the student is in the classroom in the mode of instruction, and really the purpose of school, is to help the student understand and shape their world, learn to investigate, to think, to create, to analyze the world around them. What is school about at that point? What is school? Well, it's a place where students can take risks and exchange feedback. That's what the science and engineering classroom is all about in a next generation inquiry environment. It's about developing it. It's about students. I want to be clear about that. It's about students developing and using their ideas to solve problems, designing their experiments to test new ideas that are theirs, and considering others' results and giving and receiving feedback. So the kind of culture of critique. So how students participate in class is really as a scientist and engineer would. And so the details of execution really model the details of execution that a scientist or engineer would engage in as they engage their work. So asking questions, using what they know, testing what they don't know, finding ways to gather useful data, using data to reflect on solutions, and accepting and contributing feedback so that the claims that are made are examined and something that are created from data as well. When you think about, what does the world expect of a student and why education is valuable, I hope you see this kind of next generation environment and the details of execution aligning much better to that type of, the big values of why we're teachers and why our schools exist in our communities, and really the kind of mode of instruction that we need to have in order to provide that benefit to those students. And I hope you understand that as the next generation science standards are really pushing for this kind of details of execution, that we understand that they reflect that mode and those values. And I think the reason that I'm starting with this and really, trying to explain this first and foremost is that people, as they are realigning or developing next generation science standards aligned curriculum, get stuck in the details of execution. And what they end up doing is either pulling together or developing a whole bunch of things that don't connect, that don't actually mirror the nature of science and engineering, and don't actually pull from the purpose of the next generation science standards, and so they don't actually reflect effective STEM instruction, and they don't understand why. And a lot of times, if a community values, data, and I use that as an example because it's such a wide open way of framing it. What does it mean to value data? Does that mean that you want all of your students to be exemplary or proficient on standardized testing? I don't think you'll find anybody who doesn't want that of their students. But if that's the sole focus and goal, then you really miss the purpose of education in its entirety, because no employer cares about a student's 4th grade or 5th grade or 8th grade or 10th grade standardized test scores on a state test. But an employer does care that a student is able to view their job as a place where they can take risks and exchange feedback and actually participate in taking what they know and extending it, and viewing that job as an opportunity to understand and shape their world. So by teaching students and using the next generation science standards and creating curriculum around that type of framework, what happens is that you actually produce, and I'm going to show you some data in a little bit where you can see this actually happening on standardized testing. Students will achieve the goals of the standardized testing, but they actually are going to be even better equipped and excel beyond actually what state averages show as well, and I can kind of show you how that happens. But the nature of science and engineering, it's something that comes to us from the standards, and it's important that you understand what it is, because again, back to that curriculum, there are a lot of resources out there that claim that they're next generation aligned, but they aren't. What they're doing is they're catering to create worksheets and tools and resources that help people see the details of execution reflect the words that are found in the standards, but they don't actually pull together at a high level sort of the ethos of the standards and what the nature of science and engineering is, because that's where all these standards come from, and that's why it's actually defined in the standards as well. So science is knowledge from experimentation. Scientists ask questions, they develop or plan experiments, they carry them out, those experiments produce data, and they use that data to form evidence-based conclusions about the hypothesis they're testing. Okay? Engineers use that knowledge to solve problems. So engineers identify problems and they use their knowledge of science to solve them. They do that by developing prototypes and testing them, gathering data around it, and then forming a conclusion about that prototype as to whether or not it solves the problem. That prototype, once it's out of prototype phase, is technology. And so it forms a kind of cycle because engineers use the technology, scientists can use that technology to answer new questions. But at the same time, there are little kind of iterations in here as well as scientists are asking more and more questions the more and more they discover, the more knowledge they gather, and engineers are constantly finding new ways, better ways of solving problems. Math is at the center of it all because it's a tool of communication, quantifying and communicating. That flows right into the new definition of effective science instruction. This comes directly from the standards from the National Research Council all the way back to 2011. Effective STEM instruction capitalizes, or we could say science instruction, it capitalizes on students' early interests and experiences. It identifies and builds on what they know, and it provides them with experiences to engage them in the practices of science and sustain their interest. So it's a movement from what you see on the left, where that traditional model is showing the I do, kind of you do model. I'll model this, I'll write it on the board, I'll give you the diagram, and then you do it as a student, to one where students are in the role of scientist and engineer actually using the practices, which are the skills specific to the discipline, to answer questions and solve problems, building on what they know and extending it. Okay, and so to unpack this a little further, just quickly, the effective next generation science curriculum has to have a kind of scope and sequence to it that is intentional. It has to be very thoughtful. Lessons have to build, units have to build, so scaffolding is key. Not long-term spiraling where you do something once and don't come back to it for years. Not that idea that I own a standard in my grade level because it is noted as a grade, standard in this grade level. You're actually grouping standards, okay? So that things are introduced, mastered, and reinforced. That's the key here. So, and also starting in pre-K, kindergarten, and nurturing students all the way up. It's not the kind of thing that can just happen at a 4th grade level or a 5th grade level in 1 year. So to give you an example of what that looks like, I'm going to use an example from KnowAtom because that's what I have access to. And this is just looking at grades 1 through 5. You can see how you have the strands and they carry across from one grade level to the next, and there's an intentional unit order because these ideas are scaffolding, right? What we learn about our solar system is relevant to where we live here on Earth. I'm just going to use grade 2 as an example. Our Earth is a very unique place in our solar system, and in fact, that the plants and animals and characteristics of Earth, the characteristics of Earth help define the kind of plants and animals that live here and why we have different ecosystems and the kinds of predator and prey and food chains that exist. And so when we think about the relationship between predator and prey, we can also think about not only animals and plants, but also things like insects and how there are life cycles and food chains and food webs that emerge and how energy transfers. And so when you start to think about energy, energy is not something that's just unique to living things. It's actually part of inanimate objects. It's part of our solar system. It's part of our universe. But it's also something that we can master as humans to accomplish goals. And so we think about things like electricity and circuitry and boats and other things that we engineer, like our homes, because all of these things are solving problems for us. And so as we shift from our role as a scientist to our role as an engineer, we can see how science and engineering relate. So you can see just within a year kind of how that unfolds, but from 1 year to the next, how we can go deeper and deeper and deeper with those concepts, not only within the year, but from 1 year to the next, so that we don't have any systemic gaps in our district. Okay? If a student joins in one grade level, let's say that a student joins in grade 4, if a standard is only addressed in grade 3, then if you have grade 4 or grade 5 testing, that student will never have exposure to that standard. They'll have no opportunity to really develop the skills and take the risks prior to testing. And not that testing is the end goal here, but if you kind of think of it as twofold. One, we want students to be proficient and actually we're held accountable to that. beyond it, we want to make sure that there's no gaps that emerge later in life for the student as well as they go on to high school or beyond. So when we think about alignment as well, we have to think about it being something that's three-dimensional. And I'm going to jump into that here in a second when we, what does it mean to nurture science and engineering practice skills? That's a key dimension of these new next generation science standards. That is going to be the role of any next generation aligned curriculum, okay? Next generation science standard aligned curriculum has to be aligned in three dimensions. So those are the three foundation boxes you see here below the performance expectation. So the performance expectation is the standard. It's what students have to demonstrate as a result of instruction. That's what they've instruction equips the students at a mastery level to be able to perform these expectations in any context, but really it's the three dimensions that are coming together in that next generation environment. So you can kind of picture the classroom where students are the scientists and engineers using their skills with the content. They're encountering the cross-cutting concepts, observing that, using what they know about them, and the teacher's helping the student understand how to engage appropriately. So you see all three dimensions: content, cross-cutting concepts, and the science engineering practices. Okay, it's authentic because the student is doing it. Okay, it's not just the doing it. I really don't like the word doing. Doing has a following connotation. It means that the student is using their ideas. It means the student is, if we were driving a bus or a car, the student is driving. They're deciding. They're making a lot of decisions here which require those skills, practices. So these are the next generation science and engineering practices. There are 8 of them at a high level. And so think of this from a student's perspective. A student has to be equipped. Okay, the next generation model of inquiry is intended to equip students with those skills, and then they use those skills to develop and use the content, observe those cross-cutting concepts. So a student has to be equipped to ask questions and define problems, and they should be doing that in the classroom. That's the role of curriculum. There's a difference between curriculum and standards. Standards are accountability regulations. Curriculum is how students reach mastery and become equipped to actually meet the requirements of the regulations, actually demonstrate proficiency of the regulations, okay, if that's even proper English to say it that way. So a student has to not only be able to use a model, but develop it, not only carry out an investigation, but plan it, not only interpret data, analyze it, not only kind of use mathematics, but think mathematically and computationally. And by the way, this isn't just true of 12th grade students. This is true of kindergarten students. You see, what changes as students move from 1st grade to 8th grade, or kindergarten to grade 12, is sort of the complexity of the type of expression that the student is capable of. And that's where we come into that grade level appropriateness. The type of questions and the type of models that a kindergartner develops is very different than a 3rd grader, than a 4th grader, than a 5th grader, than a 10th grader, or even a 12th grader. So that's where the kind of the variation is. So students at all levels need to be constructing the explanations, designing the solutions, arguing from evidence, their evidence, what they've gathered, what they've thought of, and that's when you're thinking about your next generation science curriculum, that's its job. Okay, its job is not only sort of a content dimension, okay, knowing that ecosystems exist, but it's even the content dimensions of next generation science students are much more dynamic than that. It's that ecosystems can be described in terms of their parts as systems and as a whole, and how the interactions of these parts actually have a system behavior, that there are inputs and outputs, and that we can actually use these science and engineering practices to access and understand ecosystems. And so the performance expectation will be that a student is able to describe and identify and use and sort of a part of an ecosystem and sort of think of it in terms of its larger context and its interactions. And that's why there are a relationship between these three dimensions, the science and engineering practices, the disciplinary core ideas, and the cross-cutting concepts, and what we call science and engineering processes. Okay, and so effective next generation science curriculum is going to not only involve the three dimensions, which you see as practices, disciplinary core ideas, and cross-cutting concepts, and having that applied in many different contexts, but it's actually going to involve science and engineering processes. And I'm not going to get into this too deeply, but it's important to understand that that a practice like those 8 practices we saw earlier, okay, these 8 are part of both science and engineering. Just the way that word choice, voice, and sentence structure are part of every written work that exists. However, the science and engineering processes are how the practices are actually applied to go from a question to a conclusion, or from a problem to a solution. And think of them as these, I guess, science and engineering process is really a tool to solving problems and answering questions. Okay, so back to the example of word choice and voice as being part of every piece of writing. Well, every written work follows some form of writing process. A writing process is brainstorming, some kind of drafting or pre-writing, some type of a review process, and then actually publishing that written work. Now, there are high-quality published works that are, written works, and there are very low-quality ones. We might say, the kind of common email as being really low quality. It may follow very little process at all. And so, it is what it is. A high-quality work that's written is going to follow a very rigorous writing process. What you see on your screen is a scientific process. So in the context of science, remember the nature of science and engineering. Scientists ask questions and develop experiments to gather data and test hypotheses, which we get evidence to whether or not that hypothesis answers the question or not. And in the case of engineering, we develop a prototype of a solution that we think as engineers may solve a problem. We gather the data by testing, and that's key. If you think you're engineering something and you're not, there's no test that yields quantitative data, you're not engineering something, that's crafting. If a student isn't developing it, in either case, if a student is not developing the experiment, or if they are not developing the test and prototype and process, it is not authentic. It's not engineering. It's like a paint by number. Paint by number is not painting. It's coloring. In this case, it would be crafting or something of that nature. Okay, so it's important to know that, because from this perspective of effective next generation science curriculum, there are different kinds of resources that result in, of course, different readiness levels. So if you think about readiness as ranging from awareness to mastery, awareness-ready resources are very simple. They typically fit on a page or two. If you think about a lesson plan for an awareness-ready outcome, it's very open-ended. It's not very well defined. It's something that is really, and awareness-ready resources are the kind of things oftentimes that are available from companies that engage in STEM work, that want to talk about how they use science or how they use engineering. There's a simple kind of explanation to help students become aware of what science and engineering is. Museums often create these types of things. I kind of think of awareness-ready resource as being something that's part of an outreach program, something that's kind of easy to kind of transfer to somebody, show them a little bit about it, and have them replicate that in a class quickly, so that a student is going to be aware of some aspect of the discipline, but what it's not doing is it's not giving them much more than that. So if you think about an awareness-ready resource as, a student will be able to raise their hand and say, hey, I know what a scientist is, or I know what an engineer is. They, answer a question, solve a problem, and okay, great. Doesn't mean they know much more beyond that. So a knowledge-ready resource is the kind of thing that we often associate with textbooks, where we learn all about what a scientist or engineers have discovered or solutions that they've developed. It's really kind of concept-oriented or fact-oriented, I guess probably better even than concept, where things are really just explained. So knowledge, somebody who's very knowledgeable can come into your class as a guest speaker, and so you might have a scientist or engineer who comes and visits your class and tells students all about what they do, or even explains all about a concept. Okay, so now students are knowledgeable about the concept. Doesn't mean that they can actually perform a task related to it. It just means they're knowledgeable about it. Performance-ready resources is oftentimes the kind of thing that we associate with kits, where students will learn things like, if you rock and mineral test, if you wanted to find out how hard or soft a rock or mineral is, you scratch it. And by scratching it on a surface of different, known hardness levels, we can determine that, how hard the mineral is. Mastery readiness is a resource that is focused on developing those science and engineering practice skills so that the students are able to go into any context and identify the necessary information to be able to develop a plan or a process to be able to gather the necessary data from a context and actually form a conclusion using that data about a hypothesis or about a prototype in order to form a reason-based, a reasoned, evidence-based conclusion. So an example of that would be, so here's kind of a difference and kind of a way of thinking about that in the classroom. So for example, a student at a mastery-ready level who's given a context of an invasive species in a pond and different choices, potential ways of solving the issue of the invasive species, perhaps through a herbicide or through some sort of a predator like a fish that could eat an invasive weed, or perhaps actually hiring people to go in and pull the weed out by hand. A student has to look at the context, has to be able to look at the possible solutions, and then has to be able to pull data from that context or develop a test which will yield data that's useful for determining what is the best fit solution. So if you think about the fish, the fish may eat the weed, but what happens when the fish are gone? What do the fish eat when the weed is gone? What if the fish eat not just the weed, but other fish? Could that actually cause a species to go extinct? So on and so forth. What kind of implications would that have in the ecosystem? Herbicide may kill more than just the invasive species, might kill everything. And in fact, when we think about that as a system, it might actually cause an erosion on the lakeshore to increase because then now there are no plants available to hold on to the dirt that's there. In the case of people may not be able to pull all of the weed out, and actually people may be a very costly and impractical way of doing something. So a student who's operating at a mastery-ready level is equipped with the skills to actually think through and participate in developing and using the facts to form an evidence-based conclusion. Okay, that is mastery readiness, and that's what the next generation science standards are looking for. That's why learning happens in 3 dimensions, and that's why these are considered performance expectations. And I'm going to show you some examples of resources. If you want to take a look, there are some on our website, KnowAtom.com/curriculum, that actually set up this type of environment too, if you want to take a look at that. But it's important to understand that you want to aim your redevelopment or realignment efforts at mastery readiness. Okay, you're not looking for lower level resources to generate awareness and knowledge and performance. You're looking to generate an environment where mastery readiness is achieved, and so you have to pull really a lot of dimensions together for that. And that environment is going to require creating, evaluating, and analyzing to happen simultaneously. Okay, It's not something that happens in isolation. So if you think of Bloom's taxonomy, it's normally 6 levels: remembering, understanding, applying, analyzing, evaluating, creating. Well, with the next generation science standards, creating, evaluating, and analyzing happen simultaneously, and not as part of a culminating activity, but in fact as part of the mode of instruction in that next generation inquiry environment. Keep that in mind. That next generation inquiry environment should be aligned and, well, it depends, I guess, if your state has also adopted Common Core ELA and Math. But one way or another, whether or not you have adopted Common Core ELA and Math, the curriculum should integrate ELA and Math, because if you look at those Common Core Math practices, the science and engineering practices are very close complement to that, and actually next generation science curriculum environment is a perfect opportunity for actually doing applied math. Okay. On the ELA side, you have those Common Core technical ELA subject standards, nonfiction reading, and all those sort of pieces. And so you can take a look at our resources. We do this. You can see how that comes together, and even how we can document it. It comes together so well. 3 key resources that you want to use as part of your alignment process, development process, or realignment process are here. First, understanding the spirit and construction of NGSS through a framework for K-12 science education, which is available for free for download on the NRC, the National Academies Press, but it's the NRC 2012 is the most recent edition. The ISBN number's there for you. And understand, too, that NGS innovations are going to make most traditional resources obsolete. And you can really see that through the PEEC alignment criteria that's available from Achieve. You're going to have to Google that one, but it's PEEC is how you spell PEEC. It's the Next Generation Science Standards primary evaluation of the essential criteria for alignment. And once you have kind of a understanding of the frameworks and PEEC alignment, because PEEC alignment is really at a macro level. It's something when you're not thinking just about an activity, but really thinking about a year, from one year to the next, and actually as a building or as a district, how your curriculum needs to be constructed. Third, you want to look at using the EQuIP rubric for science that's available. If you don't have it already from us, that's another thing you can easily Google, download, or grab it from us. We'd be happy to send that to you, and which really looks at the nuances of the activities, really that final execution, sort of the details of execution that are there. And if you want to see what a unit reader material looks like that's NGSS aligned but also meets the PEEC and the EQuIP criteria, you can go to KnowAtom.com/curriculum, and you can actually see that downloaded for free. It's, I think imitation is the most sincere form of flattery. So what I want to talk about now is the 5 key pivots from that PEEC evaluation criteria, the essential criteria for alignment. One is that your curriculum is going to have to be 3-dimensional. We already talked about that, but it has to be 3-dimensional. That's what the learning experience has to involve. And so the learning environment is grouping standards, not just in isolation and not happening just in one year, but actually over multiple years. Those standards reappear, they're introduced, mastered, and reinforced to prevent systemic gaps and also to show connection between the disciplines. Second thing is that students have to be engaging in explaining for themselves purposeful phenomenon and designing purposeful solutions. It's a picture from one of our clients' classes in 2nd grade. So using the disciplinary core ideas, all 3 dimensions, the practices and the cross-cutting concepts as a tool. So students need to be using these as a tool to answer questions or solve problems. So that's where that process comes in again. At a 2nd grade level, it's going to look something like this. This is an example from us, where students are going to have some structure, but a lot of ownership and release of responsibility, and that's something that happens over the course of the year. At a higher level, and actually in our case it starts in 4th grade, where students really, when we think about the 4 C's, that collaboration, that's happening all the way across, right? The creation and so on. But the starting in 4th grade, in our case, students have an entirely blank lab notebook where they are planning their own investigations with their peers. And so curriculum has to support that, and that's part of having this be kind of meaningful engagement. Number 3, the pivot is that the curriculum aligned to NGSS has to incorporate the engineering design process as well as the scientific process, but also the nature of science and pulling the practices and cross-cutting concepts together. So really kind of thinking, again, this is, I guess, another way of saying 3-dimensional learning. The nature of science engineering needs to be at the heart of it. And don't forget those processes is how we go from a question to an evidence-based conclusion, or from a problem to an evidence-based solution. Now, engineering should be integrated with science, not something that's happening in isolation. And it's important to understand how that happens in curriculum. So remember, in this case, this is an example, science, from the nature of science and engineering, we know is developing experiments to actually answer questions and test hypotheses. So here, in one lesson, students are learning about the water cycle, and actually they're using their knowledge of the water cycle to really learn about how different earth materials have different permeability to groundwater. And so they tackle that question, their teams, and go through a scientific process applying the practice skills. And then in the next lesson, and of course a lesson is not even, it's not just a day, it's like a week. Students learn about pollution and non-point source pollution, and they begin to think about how pollution in one area can affect groundwater in another area because of the interaction between the water cycle and groundwater flows in aquifers. And so the next lesson is dealing with students, being in the role of engineer and actually trying to solve the problem of groundwater pollution by developing a low-cost solution that removes pollutants from groundwater. So it follows an engineering design process now instead of that scientific process. But you can see how there's an interplay between the ideas. And using the knowledge and connection to the water cycle and groundwater, students are now trying to solve a problem that exists within groundwater. And this also has a lot of implications for place-based learning as well. Okay, and whatever we are teaching also needs to be assessed. So here's a couple examples of assessments from one of our units. If you come from a park, community, or state, or smart or balanced, students are required to engage in performance expectations in ELA, or performance assessments in ELA. Guess what? They're coming to science shortly if they're not already in your state, in a place like Ohio or so on. So I'm going to just briefly mention that the assessments are going to have to require students to synthesize what they've learned, so it's not entirely the result of direct instruction, right? New context, new scenario, but the fundamentals are there. The fourth piece is that you need to have a coherent learning progression pre-K-12, K-12, so on. And so that's why when you see, I'm using our example here, we have grade level specific curriculum and unit order. It hits on many different levels, from a user experience for the student. A student needs to be nurtured throughout the year and from one year to the next. And so that's how you build the depth and the breadth of understanding. And you can see it flows right up through grade 8. I'm just using this as an example here. Okay, really key for effective instruction and also creating data gains. And I'm going to show you how that works, preventing systemic gaps, especially as districts are large. The larger a district gets, and also the more transient students are, or if you're in a community where there may be, you don't have to have refugees. You may have a military base in your community, and students, just by virtue of their parents' employment, are constantly coming and going. The Interstate Compact here in the U.S. is a great tool for bringing communities that serve our service members together, but at a classroom level, at a district level, you need to have a cohesive curriculum that's not going to leave students behind just because they entered in 4th grade and not in pre-K. So the 5th pivot that's important, the 5th and final, is that NGSS connects to ELA and math, and specifically Common Core. We already kind of mentioned this, but the skills that we're learning in science and engineering through these practices, arguing from evidence, well, there's evidence-based writing in ELA. Actually reading for understanding, making concept-to-concept connections, concept-to-self connections, concept-to-world connections, all ELA strategies, all ELA connections. Math practices entirely relate, graphing, data collection, and so on. So huge piece of next generation curriculum that's effectively aligned is the key here. There's a lot of NGSS stuff out there. It's just not effectively aligned, and it's not really a curriculum. Just a lot of kind of tools and things like that. So I want to share with you a process for reaching NGSS alignment, whether you're going through development or redevelopment. So when you think about curriculum, that may have a lot of different meanings. So I want to challenge that and encourage you to start really by envisioning the student and teacher experience, by really focusing on the curriculum that you create being an example of exceptional written and oral communication, so that it's really supporting any educator in your community and any learner as well. And that requires also a deep understanding of human organizational behavior. So this is not just right at the get-go. This is not a job for one person. At our organization, we have a team of folks that bring all these skills to the table, and they function as a team. You know, we're a 21st century organization, and the organizations that we work with are 21st century organizations. That's why they value what we do. And that's why we also get the outcomes that we get as well, which I'll share with you in a minute. The next piece of this is having processes to develop and use the science and engineering practices, cross-cutting concept, and disciplinary core ideas. That is that scientific process, the engineering design process, making sure that, and this is all kind of in a planning stage too, that your team understands the kind of relationship between the disciplinary core ideas and how they relate to each other through cross-cutting concepts. And having a nuanced understanding of the disciplinary core ideas is really helpful. So if you're thinking about your team members, making sure that you have someone on your team like that, really key. At this point, once you kind of have that piece together, that knowledge set and skill set in your team, that's when you can really begin networking the performance expectations, because again, you're not teaching these in isolation, you're teaching them in groups. That's how units are formed. And before you can form a unit, you really need to think about the horizontal and vertical articulation. So you want to think about kind of a progression within a year, and then the progression from one year to the next. And that's kind of, I guess, the visual of that is something like this, thinking, okay, how do I go from September through June through my unit sequence, and then how would I go from 6th grade to 7th grade? And that's huge for students. That's how students really, really get a firm understanding of what science and engineering is, and so on. The final piece that forms curriculum is really the materials, the content experience, and the lessons themselves. So defining those units, now you can actually begin envisioning the content experience, pulling that together as lessons, and then defining what materials you need. All of that is what is curriculum, okay? And you, like we do here, you need to have a continuous feedback loop. So just because you've created something doesn't mean it's good. So what you need to do is you need to be monitoring educators in the field. You need to be have a structure in place to pull feedback as educators need to reach out, provide that feedback, and then deploying that back into the field for folks who either are encountering similar challenges or haven't encountered the challenge yet. And that is really a process of continuous improvement, which is something that we take pretty seriously here. So what I'd like to do next, since we've kind of gone through the higher level pieces of all this, is really walk you through what an NGSS aligned unit looks like, one that's PEEC and EQuIP compliant, and look at it from a teacher's perspective and then from a student's perspective. Now, we're at the hour mark now, and I would expect that we're going to take another 15 minutes. So if you have any questions, feel free to drop those in. I see we have a few already. I know some folks are going to have to jet, but I think that this is going to help pull it all together for you here. So I want to use really tangible examples. If you need to reach out, you can reach out through our website or through one of the emails that were sent to you if you do have to run. And I will stick around. If this takes 10-15 minutes, I will stick around another 10-15 minutes after that to address the questions or go back to any slides that you wish. Okay, so here we go. So taking a look at the components. So, and I'm going to use KnowAtom as an example because I really believe we do an exceptional job. I know we have great data to prove that from state-level standardized testing, so I'm going to use this as an example. There are basic components, and if you'd like to see any of these, you can download it for free from our website. We have the curriculum, the reader example. What you'll get is an example of about a month's worth of content, and you can't download physical materials, but we have those too. So if your district is, and I'm not giving a sales pitch here, but if I see some questions about this, if your district is in a curriculum review process, if you're thinking about adoption for September and so on, we do have all of these, grade 1 all the way through grade 8 available for purchase. That's how we keep the lights on here. But you can at least, if you're creating your own, download the examples. If you are looking to actually purchase something, then you can reach out to Mary Ellen or through a contact us on our website or one of the emails you got, and we'll get you the right person. Okay, so you think about it, there's the curriculum component. Professional development's a key piece of a new implementation as well, and then materials. So curriculum, that's really, that's how teachers are supported, that defines scope and sequence and so on. Professional development really helps educators understand what they have, how to, some best practices, how to map existing skill sets over to address the expectations of the next generation science standards, really understand what those 3 dimensions look like in a classroom, and then actually having the materials necessary to execute. So teachers are not going out spending out of pocket, but actually the district is taking that on, providing it to the teacher, so that again, it shouldn't be up to a teacher to make the choice of purchasing something in order for a classroom to be effective. It really needs to be on the district. So those pieces have to combine to really make that STEM learning environment effective. The way we approach it is really the nonfiction reading starts off. This is how a lesson unfolds. It's nonfiction reading. Then there's Socratic dialogue, so asking higher order questions to connect what the reading was, kind of common foundation that the reading sets for students, and helping connect that concept to concept, concept to self, and concept to world and discussion, and then having that release of responsibility to students. Of course, curriculum structured to help students develop these skills, but the release of responsibility to students so that they are planning their investigations in teams, then carrying them out to gather data, then forming their own conclusions and sharing them as part of debriefs. So the reading establishes background knowledge, the Socratic dialogue happens, and again, kind of that visual of teacher as moderator, student as kind of that higher order participant, and while both are thinking about the cross-cutting concepts and disciplinary core ideas that they've read about through the nonfiction reading, it's the teacher artfully asking those higher order questions that require students to use their higher order thinking to respond and form the connections, okay? Creating plans, actually accessing content by using the practices really starts with the planning. And this is, when a student's creating a scientific plan or an engineering plan using the scientific or engineering process, they're actually creating a nonfiction text. So, this is an ELA skill right here that, when you hand a student some pre-made procedure or something, you completely negate the value of the potential here. in a curriculum, and that's why curriculum should be set up to allow this. So here's an example again from a student. This would be a middle school student, but you can see, create a plan. Then the student carries out the plan. They gather the data, and then they form their conclusion based on their data. This is authentic. That's authenticity. It's the student's idea. If you go into a classroom, there might be teams of 2 all around the room, but if you take a lab notebook from one team of 2 and you look at the lab notebook from another team of 2, it should have a lot of variation. The data should vary, maybe the procedure varies, some of the materials used should vary, quantities and such. Hypothesis is likely to vary, and of course the conclusions are likely to vary, at least in the types of data and a lot of the kind of way students are reflecting on that. And this is what it looks like as students are actually carrying out their plans. Okay, I like to use these pictures a lot because it just sort of shows all different environments, kids inside, kids outside, if that's an option, whether it's paved or not. These are students using our program in the Kurdish region of northern Iraq, and in refugee school, camp schools is what this is. The students are from all over Syria and Iraq and so on. It's really just interesting. We could Photoshop the floor out of this, and these 2 students could be in a classroom anywhere in the U.S. And using the data that's gathered to form those conclusions. And then when we think of arguing from evidence, that is part of that debrief time. Students, they've met their checkpoints. Of course, this isn't just a full release of responsibility to students where, we'll see you next week, hope it all comes out okay. Remember, the role of the teacher in this next generation inquiry environment is to actually help, you create milestones, and then you are helping the student understand how to engage appropriately and redirecting and monitoring, and that's what those checkpoints are for. But debrief is a big opportunity for students to share what they did and their ideas, and to compare their results to other folks, and consider the ideas of others, and also give feedback, but also take feedback. It's a key part of that culture of critique that is really necessary in a next generation inquiry environment. So when I pull a resource, this is one of our resources. This is an example you can download from, I'm not sure if you can download this exact unit, but you can, this is from 7th grade. I'm pulling an example from 7th grade, but you'll be able to pull one from 7th grade if you're a 7th grade teacher. So I'm just going to show you how we structure, and these are screenshots. There's a lot of pages missing. For the teacher, we show the lesson progression. We explain, here's how the 3 lessons in this unit happen. Now, a lesson, like I said, is a week for middle school. That's got 45, 55 minutes a day, and so this is 3 weeks, maybe as much as 4 weeks, 4.5 weeks of teaching, time on learning. And so it's all laid out here. So every unit's a month. So you're looking at about 9 units a year. And then you have an overview, unit objectives, and then you can actually see how the next generation science standards are being applied, and you can see how they're grouped in this unit. So you see here's the standard, and then these are how the different dimensions, if you're familiar with the color coding of the dimensions, you can see the disciplinary core idea and the cross-cutting concept, how it's being applied in this lesson. Lesson 3, it's explained. Down here you can see how the standard and the disciplinary core idea and cross-cutting concept is applied in this lesson, and so on. You see how Earth systems, ecosystems, and engineering are all coming together across different lessons. See here, lesson 2 and 3, so on. And then when it comes to the practices, we have dedicated an entire sort of section to practices in and of themselves. You can see how all the different practices are reflected in lesson 1. In lesson 2, how different practices are reflected, and it's explained to the teacher. So the purpose of this is so that teachers understand the purpose of the lesson, because it may not be obvious to them. Why am I teaching this? Why are they learning about this? What's the focus of this lesson from a standards perspective? Next thing is having scaffolding vocabulary. So it's lesson specific, and what's in the teacher's unit and support mirrors what's in the student's reader, so that the students are referring and understanding vocabulary words by the same definition. And that's huge, and actually this is a big point of why curriculum articulation from one grade level to the next is so important, because in our case, this is one of the benefits of being in our position and what we do, is that our vocabulary is consistent so that when we talk about groundwater, when we say groundwater, it has a definition that's universal across grade levels. So it doesn't mean that the vocab list in every grade level is the same, but if and when we refer to groundwater in any grade level, we refer to it by this definition. So the student understands that groundwater is groundwater is groundwater. Okay, that's really huge, really, really huge. And you'll see, I mean, science in and of itself, you could go and get a poster on science. You get 100 posters on science, and each one's going to have a different definition. So if you put all 100 posters up in your room and ask the student what is science, what should they answer? And that's the point, is that having consistency and having alignment is even at this level a huge part of effective curriculum in next generation science standards. And really even under any standards, but becomes even more important. Next piece of curriculum that's key is supporting teachers' background knowledge. So what we do, you can see we even do it here at a middle school level. We do it at every grade level. Because we're crossing all these different disciplines and we have a very accurate representation of concepts and vocabulary and so on, we want to make sure that the teachers have the support to be able to hold quality Socratic dialogues with their students and at an adult level have an understanding of what they're teaching. And so we're supporting it here through content. And again, this is just a screenshot. There's a lot more to it than 2 pages. Next piece is that the lessons, like I said, it's more than a day, but it's actually laying out for you here the objectives, the materials that are needed, and these are materials, in our case of our clients, we're providing, whether they're consumables or non-consumables, and prep notes, not sending a note home for bottles. Hopefully, I mean, if you're using our curriculum, you don't have to do that, but if you're using whatever you're doing, hopefully that's not a part of that either. But then actually helping isolate the big ideas, giving higher order questions that help the teachers form triads for that Socratic dialogue, and actually helping them chunk and use visuals in connection with the right parts of the dialogue and understand the types of answers that they're looking to get from students as they're forming this group discussion and where to segment and stop content in different blocks. Giving teachers the level of support to be able to fully guide something if they need it, but again, designing around a full release of responsibility. And the piece that I don't have in here because we're running out of time and also it just doesn't happen to be in here, but we've shown it already a little earlier, vocabulary assessments, concept assessments, activity assessments that give an opportunity beyond the hands-on lab creation assessment itself and students actually in the role of scientist and engineer, but something beyond that. So again, like I said, vocabulary assessments, concept assessments that give an opportunity to assess the different dimensions of the standards and the standards themselves. So from a student's perspective, and I'm going to make this just under 15 minutes extra here, establishing background knowledge through that reading material. So thinking about how you segment your reading material. We generate all our own nonfiction reading. The reason is that a lot just doesn't exist, and a lot of it's really poor quality, and a lot of it is not grade level specific, and so we can control all those various variables. We create our own. So this is lesson 1, lesson 2, lesson 3, and that's why it's called section 1, section 2, section 3. The way we create nonfiction reading is not to create paragraphs to explain words. What we do is we actually use the words and we use the concepts together in a real context, just like a newspaper article would, and we explain it through a real-life context that a student could Google if they wanted to and find. And so those scaffold as the reading as you go page to page. And so some little assessments in there. ELA, Common Core, and math connections are a huge part of curriculum, like I said, especially if you're from a Common Core state. So what we do is we embed those in the reading material as an option for the teacher to actually add value to what, so in this case here, understanding an author's opinion and viewpoint by taking an actual article that relates to the content and concepts in this reading, and that's documented in the back of a unit if you want to take a look at that. And then, of course, having the students have access to those vocabulary words as well, and so on. You can see I've only taken a few screenshots here that a reader at this is a grade 7 level, is 26 pages, but over the course of 9 units, it's like a textbook, really, but it's just so much better and so much less intimidating. So I'm just going to click through some quick data, and I'm going to take your questions now. So what does this actually do for, let's say, urban schools? Well, here's an example. So we have been employing, how did we get to this point to be aligned where we are right now with the next generation science standards, in many cases either just being implemented or on the verge? Well, we've been developing this into our curriculum, since 2009. We've been around 10 years. But since 2009, when those early reports and early work was being undertaken for the next generation science standards, we were watching all of this and saying, wow, this really is what science and engineering is about. These really are just great practices for teaching and learning. And so we started to develop it into our curriculum, and that's how we've gotten where we are today. But even under the existing assessments, and these are, I'm going to use examples from Massachusetts because I want you to be able to see apples to apples comparisons in different kind of district profiles. So this is a school where 93% of the students are low income, 96% are high needs, 66% have a first language that is not English. And you can look down the bottom how students at a warning level dropped from 45% to 7, and how, and it's varied here year to year a bit, but students have reached 36%, 37% proficiency and advanced and proficient. And this particular environment has had, science and engineering was not a priority. There was not a lot of professional development that was available through the district. There was, where you see dips, there was a change of administrator here and here. But yet what you see is a positive trend that's happening, and both in advanced and proficient and in that decrease in warning. That's why you see an increase in needs improvement, because students are actually transitioning up, and also you have skills gaps even within the teachers, unfortunately, which without professional development is, and also this comes back to values and some of those other pieces that can be tricky to address. But in the same district, I'm going to show you another building that has a sort of a different building culture and different teacher skill set. So you can see in 2.5 years, this particular school, they added 51 points to their advanced and proficient scoring students. Now, over here, basically all the teachers had changed. There was also that change of administration at a district level that impacted things. And this was, just kind of natural fluctuation over here, but you can see the positive trend in advanced and proficient. And I want to point out that the average level of proficiency in advanced scoring students in the state of Massachusetts is 50%. So for a school like this to be scoring 87%, and let me tell you what I mean by a school like this, 75% high needs, 65% free lunch, 72% low income, 35% where the first language is not English, is huge. This school outscoring, and this is, again, public school, district school, not even a charter school, really outstripping the performance levels of even some really elite suburban districts. And these last two are urban. Quickly going to show you this next couple. Again, remember 50% is the average in the state, but these folks operate upwards of 80%. You can see that huge gain right here. Another one here as well, getting upwards of 80%. This may be, I believe, at this point, the highest scoring district in the state of Massachusetts at about 90%. So you see, again, needs improvement dropping and so on. Last piece of data, and these last two were much more favorable, socioeconomics as well. I mean, they're, like I said, kind of schools with considerably less English language learners and high needs population, but to be reaching 80 and 70 is still at the level of this school over here where they're operating, which is very high needs and free and reduced lunch and so on, English language learners. This is an example of the middle school, and I'm going to take questions now. In this middle school, over the course of 2 years, you can see how they go from 4% proficient to 28%, and the dramatic drop in warning, increase in advanced and proficient. And needs improvement's a bit stable, but what's happening is students are, they're transitioning in and out, in from warning and out from needs improvement. And that's the real way to bring up the bottom, not this, just drill and kill stuff. It's, drill and kill doesn't, that's how you get to be average. And so I'll just show you the demographics on this school here. You can see, 94% low income and so on. All right, and then across the particular district, you can see the gains just last year. Okay, there was a couple. Actually, what I like about this school is they tried something different. They went off on their own and they lost 20 points. Not that I think that's a good thing, but it shows that actually having these systems in place and creating that type of environment actually does benefit student engagement, but student learning also. Okay, here's my contact information. Here's a bunch of links how you can stay connected. I'm going to grab your questions now, where you can download the curriculum. I'd encourage you to stay connected just because we do have presentations often, but we also have a lot of free resources that we will put up, and sometimes it's just the best way to get it is by either subscribing to the blog, Facebook, or Twitter. Okay, so I'm going to grab your questions here. Let's see. So some folks have asked, how can I get a copy of the slides? So the slides, what we're doing is we videotape this presentation and what you're getting now. And so you are going to get a link to that in a follow-up email. I'll have Mary Ellen will send that to you. Keep an eye on your junk mail, spam box, whatever, when we send links and so on. Best thing to do is just whitelist us based on one of the previous emails you got, and then you'll definitely get what you need. So we'll send that to you so you get a link to the video. The slides themselves we don't make available. If there's some special case where you need it, please reach out to Mary Ellen, and we'll do our best to make that available to you. For instance, in this particular presentation, there are 100 slides, so making that available is a little bit difficult. So if there are other questions, I'd be really happy to take those for you. I will gather one or two more. There are similar questions in here. So there's a question in here about special education and next generation science standards. And I think the key takeaway when you think about next generation science standards, the next generation science inquiry environment, and special education is that the next generation science standards should give you a sense of relief when it comes to special education, because the standards are not based all on rote memorization of facts. There's a skills dimension that means, as well as a systems thinking dimension, as well as a content dimension, and that students are going to be required to perform the expectation. The reason it should be a sense of relief is that this means that science instruction should not be locked inside a text. It should not be locked inside somebody explaining something and somebody having to remember it, and somebody, being entirely sort of text and rote based in their form of instruction. So so for special education students and special education classrooms, the instruction should be inquiry based, should be hands-on. That is the mode of instruction, not as a culminating activity. Reading is not how students learn it's not how students master next generation science standards. The role of reading in a next generation science classroom is just to provide some basic context. It goes from text to something that's auditory. So now, students who are oral, in their English language skills, who are, better as speakers than they are as writers. Here's an opportunity for them. Next thing you know, now you're into small group collaborative learning where students are planning investigations, right? So they're going to use those processes. Well, guess what? Special education students have great ideas too. And by working with a partner, that helps to round out skill sets like perhaps a language-based learning disability that might make either verbally expressing or expressing oneself in writing difficult, or perhaps giving somebody a slightly more limited vocabulary in one medium or another. So again, a sense of relief. There's an opportunity through collaboration for a student to better access the curriculum and master the skills. The next piece of this is debriefing and reasoning and so on. So just because a student is a special education student doesn't mean they're not a great thinker, doesn't mean that they have nothing to contribute. I mean, they have as much or more, and that's what we often hear, especially with our curriculum. We see that as well, that people will say of both, and this is the absolute truth. People will say, administrators will say, teachers will say that they didn't necessarily think a student would be operating at the level that they were operating, but they were just incredibly surprised. And the same thing oftentimes will be said of teachers, that by having a supportive curriculum, by having very goals, by having the teacher background, by having a sense of where we're going and vocabulary, having everything all in one place, teachers who they didn't expect to excel are excelling even beyond those who they expected the most of. And I know one instance where someone said, I thought that we were going to have to let this particular teacher go, but in fact they're now my best teacher. So, I think that it's important to look at curriculum as a process and as a tool, and I think of it really, when I think of KnowAtom's role in the scheme of things, we're kind of like Batman's assistant in the Bat Cave, and we create the bat suit, and teachers, they're like Batman. If we create a really great bat suit, then the teacher gets inside and the teacher can go and fight ignorance everywhere. Because someone who is, we need to learn. We need an education. That's how we're born ignorant. That's how education plays an important role in our society. And so so teachers need the bat suit. And that bat suit is high quality, well-aligned curriculum. And in this case, with the Next Generation Science Standards, it needs to be well-aligned to the standards, and it needs to be something that's cohesive and so on, which we've already talked about. And that's true of special education classrooms as well as non-special education classrooms. I think one of the key pieces to be aware of is that comparing and contrasting history here a little bit when it comes to special education classrooms and even those that aren't, is that a lot of times people kind of get in this mode of thinking like leveled readers, where they feel like they need to bring something down to students. And oftentimes, because a student is in a special education classroom and has particular barriers to learning that are on their IEP that need to be overcome or accommodated, that can unfortunately translate into educators mistakenly but intentionally removing the opportunity to learn at very high levels and to perform at very high levels because, of many different reasons, I suppose. But what we don't want to do is remove the opportunity for growth by removing challenge. What we want to do in a special education environment is accommodate, cognitive challenges, but not academic challenges, and there's a gray area there to decide which is which. But in the same exact thing is true in a regular education or mainstream classroom, that what we want to do is we want to create challenge and not remove it because without the challenge, we don't have the opportunity for growth. That's actually a key component within the PEEC alignment criteria as well. So sorry, not to have a long-winded question, answer to a short question. Let's see. Some folks have asked about how to get certificates. If you would like a certificate of participation for your time in this webinar, please respond to Mary Ellen, and she will, with your name and school information, and you'll have to remind her what webinar you're on, and she will get that back to you. And I'll take one more question before I end. And let's see, last question here. This has to do with pricing for programs and so on. That's not something I can easily answer. So here's why. The way this program, our program works is that there's curriculum, which is licensed, so think of it as a binder, and there's online access to all that material and so on. So that has a cost. And then there's actual durable materials and consumable materials. And all of that is kit in different configurations, some 12s, 15s, 25s, 30s. So the best thing to do if you're interested in pricing, if you're in a review process, is to really reach out to Mary Ellen and go back and forth and set up a time to talk, and she'll get you to the right folks there and get you connected with some kind of quote based on the way that your school is set up. Because again, if you have self-contained classrooms or more of a specialist model where people are teaching multiple sections, all of that impacts what the actual cost of things are. Well, thank you again for your time. I really appreciate it. I know that this was really a lot of material dense, and kind of trying to take something where we started out that is kind of, in a sense, maybe perhaps a bit lofty feeling, and boil that down, because it is so important, even though it seems lofty, into the foundation of where our curriculum needs to come from, and how we sort of in our ethos support curriculum, and how that curriculum environment is shaped, and then again how our students view school, view their role in the classroom, and our expectations of them, and how they should perform really appropriately, what is appropriate, and then the characteristics of what curriculum needs to provide for teachers as well as students, and creating a very rich context where students are able to take risks, perform the expectations, and really get to a mastery level early on and well in advance of any kind of standardized testing, and of course with the goal of equipping them for their future, not just a test. So thank you again for your time. I appreciate it, and have a great afternoon or evening. Bye-bye.